Hello. So this is Mr. Mack-Poole, and today I'm doing something which I've done for my A-level historians, and I'm going to start a nice little series, and this one's going to be on the Cold War. So I'm making this video just in case anyone is absent or can't access the lesson, and I've already started the do now in the lesson. But the main thing that I really want to go through is NATO. Okay, so what were the consequences of the USA establishing NATO in 1949? Okay, so before we answer that question, let's have a refresher on the formation of NATO, and this is actually on our next slide. Okay, so why was NATO formed in April 1949? Well, there's numerous reasons for this, okay, which some of these photos allude to there. So the British Empire was in decline. It no longer had the might, will, or resources to halt the spread of communism / Soviet influence from Eastern Europe. So, especially in the area of Greece, which has become a key area in the Truman Doctrine, the British Empire, kind of World War II, I kind of think of it as a Pyrrhic victory, like a victory in name, a victory which bankrupted an empire. Was the victory of World War II for Britain. And so although we have this big three meeting of Churchill, Truman, and Stalin, and of course there are three conferences, Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, which we've already looked at, Britain's status as one of the big three is very kind, I'd say, because really there's a big two, and maybe it's 2.5, but certainly the USA and the USSR are far more powerful than Britain, and that's the point I'm trying to make without labouring it too much. But Britain had lost its power and could no longer fund an anti-communist movement in Greece, and so Greece and Turkey look like two countries which, according to domino theory, the idea that when one country falls to communism, the next one to it will, and so on and so forth. According to domino theory, look like Greece and Turkey were looking pretty vulnerable to communism. So there's another cause as well. We're going to point 2. Hostile reaction has already been established in the 1946 Iron Curtain speech, which obviously Winston Churchill had made with his great friend Truman. Now, Truman really was willing to turn a blind eye to empire because America, if you think about it, was a country which was born or created expressly in revolution to imperial power. Okay, it's a republican nation, a country without a monarch. They had the American War of Revolution against the British. And yet, Truman really was willing to back up the British Empire for a long time there, and he was very, very happy with the Iron Curtain speech. But by 1947, with the Truman Doctrine, Truman realized that if Europe was to remain, and I mean Western Europe really, was to remain a capitalist nation, then it would have to, absolutely have to, take affairs into their own hands, okay, and create an alliance system, which was essentially like the Three Musketeers, all for one and one for all. They would have to create NATO. Truman basically pumps dollars into Greece and Turkey in the Truman Doctrine. He invests in the capitalist elements in those countries to resist communism, and is successful in that event. In 1948, Marshall, who was a US general, says to Truman, look, if you want Europe to remain prosperous and democratic and capitalist, you're going to need to invest, because I'd realized that actually Germany had become a Nazi country out of the economic difficulties which they had faced. Also, Stalin had been pretty hostile to the USA with the Berlin blockade, and the USA had to carry out a subsequent airlift. So NATO was actually formed while this airlift was still being performed. Okay, so NATO was formed in 1949. The Berlin airlift carried forth until May 1949. So you can see that essentially the communist East and the capitalist West, the lines had been drawn. Okay, and let's not forget that Truman and Stalin should not be forgotten. They had a strong personal dislike of one another. I'm saying that, but with kind of slightly gritted teeth, because Truman's online saying, "Oh, I like Stalin. I know what he wanted to. He knows what he wants, and he's willing to negotiate." He says this. This quote is very early in their quote unquote diplomatic relationship, and this opinion shifted. Truman also said that he no longer wanted to baby the Russians and the communists; that he wanted to contain them. Okay, so NATO was formed for those major reasons there, right? And as I said, don't be fooled by diplomatic smiles in public or quotes which were made early on by Truman about Stalin. Look at the relationship and the way it's going, and actions speak louder than words. Now, as soon as Truman became president upon the death of FDR, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the USA really changed quite significantly, because Truman was far more communist phobic, or had genuine skepticisms about the USSR and communism in its ideology. So anyway, this is why NATO was formed in 1949. So if you look at the impact which NATO had, when we talk of the Iron Curtain, it really solidified it, because if you look at this red on the map here, okay, you can see Europe is cleft in twain. It's chopped in two between the NATO powers and the Warsaw Pact powers. And we'll get onto the Warsaw Pact in a second, okay? But you can see Europe is really, there's a Western Europe and an Eastern Europe. And still today, many of us think of Eastern Europe as not being as economically successful if we're comparing Eastern Europe to Western Europe in terms of free market capitalism, not as economically successful. This is a reason why, okay? This is a reason why, because of the American dollars, which went into Western Europe under the Marshall Plan, which the Soviet Union called this dollar imperialism. Eventually, this economic barrier between the East and West also becomes a military one. Okay, so it's almost like there's two different Europes at this stage: a communist Europe and a capitalist Europe. Also, you can see Canada and the USA, obviously members of NATO. So it's a Northern Atlantic Treaty Organization. You can see why it's Northern Atlantic, because it's over the Atlantic with Canada and the USA. So again, I just thought I'd show a slightly different map here, which shows that Iron Curtain, which Churchill talked about there, like going down. So you can see an Iron Curtain descending across Europe. Now, Yugoslavia is a bit of a strange country here, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but Yugoslavia was originally supposed to be part of the Warsaw Pact, but then Tito, who was the communist dictator of Yugoslavia, fell out with Stalin and said, "No, we're going our own way." And so they are a communist state, but they're a communist rogue state. They're a pariah rogue state, just doing their communism on their own and not doing anything the same as Stalin, whilst the rest of Eastern Europe there was completely under Stalin's control, especially with the advent of Cominform, which is whereby all of these countries have become communist nations, but Stalin tightened the control of those nations with that mechanism there. Now, it's actually quite interesting, the whole NATO story. So let me get to the Warsaw Pact, which is a kind of a reaction to this. So by 1954-55, where Khrushchev, who was the new dictator of Germany by this point, had an idea of, dictator of the Soviet Union, he wanted to diplomatically outshine the USA. So a reaction of NATO is the Warsaw Pact, which is basically a communist USSR NATO. Okay, it's their own version. It's a tit for tat mutual defense pact. Okay, so what Khrushchev wanted to do was expose how NATO was explicitly anti-communist or anti-USSR, and then make America look like the aggressive power. And to that extent, diplomatically, I think they were quite successful. So I've put this in a bit of slang, cool things to help you remember. But essentially, he's like, "Yo, Needle, can we join your club?" in an American accent for some reason. And NATO was like, "Oh, no, we don't like communists, but West Germany can join," i.e. the country which had formerly been the major backbone of Nazi Germany, but they could join. Okay. doesn't seem very fair, because they've embraced free market capitalism and are no longer Nazis. And essentially, West Germany does join NATO, and this really, really irritates the USSR because they're made to feel like they're a pariah nation outside of this alliance system of NATO. Because if the USSR joins NATO, then everything's peaceful, everything's lovely between the East and the West, the capitalist and the communist systems. But obviously, we know that's not true. There's some genuine tensions. So West Germany joins NATO, and this is it for Khrushchev. So he's like, okay, fine then, we're going to join our own club. If I can't go to your birthday party, you're not coming to mine. Okay, so it's kind of a tit for tat policy, but it shapes Europe for the next 40 years. Okay, this Iron Curtain shapes the geopolitics of the world for the next 40 years. It's massively important. I can't overstate that. So fine then, we'll make our own club. So he gets all his eastern satellite states, and he tells them that they're joining. So Hungary, Poland, Romania, West Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, I think. Anyway, look, I think I might repeat that. But anyway, so he makes them join. Bulgaria. Sorry. Right. Okay. And obviously they couldn't say no. Those countries couldn't say no because they were being controlled by the Soviet Union, because they've been centralized by the process of Comintern and now this Warsaw Pact. So, and obviously they were puppet states, and all of their governments were communists and were under the doctrine of the USSR anyway. So, or the dictatorship, if you want. Now, if they did say no to this, I think there would have been a military threat. And certainly the USSR was willing to roll tanks into Eastern European nations later on if they tried to leave the Warsaw Pact, like in 1956 with the Hungarian uprising, and in 1968 with the Prague Spring. Didn't quite try to leave the Warsaw Pact to the Czechs, but it wasn't looking too good. It wasn't looking too good. Dubček, who was the leader of Czechoslovakia at that point, was indeed looking to relax communist rule far too much. But anyway, we're getting far too ahead of ourselves. So they couldn't say no. And thus you have the Warsaw Pact, which is born. So what is a net result of NATO being created in 1949? Well, it's a solidifying of the Iron Curtain. It is blue team versus a red team. It is the capitalist versus the communist. And this geopolitical situation was to survive in continuity, really, from 1949 until the breakdown of the communist system in either, you could say, the very late 80s or the early 90s with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. To slightly complicate matters, the Eastern European satellite states had gained a large degree of independence in the late 1980s, and this is really symbolized by the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, I have to categorically say that the formation of NATO ramped up tensions between the USA and the USSR in terms of superpower relations. Now, this can be seen in the Berlin crisis at Checkpoint Charlie. This can be seen with the fact that the USSR refuses, as I've already mentioned, to let Hungary and Czechoslovakia have greater freedoms or leave the Warsaw Pact. This tension can also be seen with the continual tension of the Berlin Wall from 1961 to 1989. So that Berlin Wall was a huge issue, diplomatic rift, really, which symbolized the whole East versus Western Europe dynamic, which is caused by NATO, which is caused by what the Western power saw as an encroaching communism to Eastern Europe, which was caused by an underlying issue, which was that the capitalist system and the communist systems just can't coexist as they have contradictory aims. Okay, I hope I didn't waffle on far too much there, but I think that'll be a good bit of revision for you. I hope you enjoyed this first part of my series on the Cold War, and I'll be back with another video next week. Have a lovely, lovely day, whatever you're doing, and stay safe, guys. Stay safe. I'm going to stop recording now. Stop recording.